So welcome back to those of you who are here and to those of you who might be on the live stream. So last week we talked about the building and the spaces and the names that the church uses for all kinds of things. And I would actually say that the Episcopal Church somewhat has its own language because we have so many names for so many things. This week, we're going to talk about history and polity. So history starts all the way back to just after Jesus died on the cross and the resurrection. And then the polity of the Episcopal Church begins at the beginning of the United States. So it's going to cover a long amount of time. Please stop me if you have a question of any kind. We will have some people coming in late. Just let them come in and sit down and we'll be ready to go. So let's go all the way back to the early church. In the early church, most churches were really just groups of people who met in someone's house. And the leader of the worship would be the owner of the house or the wife of the owner of the house. Frequently, it was the wife of the owner of the house. But over time, it became clear that in each town and community, they needed a leader, and they chose one, and that would have been a bishop. That person would have been the bishop. And there weren't any other kinds of clergy. There was just the bishop, and that went on for quite a while until, you know, one of the things that the early church did was to take care of people who couldn't take care of themselves, people who were widows or disabled in some way. And women were not allowed to work in any way, in any kind of position that earned money. And so if your husband died and you didn't have a son who could work, you didn't have any source of income. So widows were the poorest people in the community, and the church helped take care of them. That became a lot of work for the bishop, to be going out to different people to see how they were and to take what they needed to them and so forth. And so the bishops instituted the idea of a deacon. And the job of the deacon was to do those jobs for the bishop that the bishop didn't have time to do. Mostly it had to do with taking care of people in the community. And then another long number of years went by, and it became clear that the bishop could not even handle the worship component of his job, especially in the bigger cities, because there would be more than one house church going on at the same time. So that's when they began to appoint presbyters. And presbyters are the same thing that we call a priest now. So then the church just functioned like that with those three orders of ordained people for 1,000 years or so, or more. Actually, quite a bit more. Please come in. Hi. So we have these bishops, deacons, and priests serving God in their communities, and the bishop was still the leader. And it became clear that the bishop in Rome was the most important bishop, because Rome was the most important city. And it's still, no matter how many worship groups there were, that's okay, come on in. No matter how many worship groups there was still only one bishop in each city. So the Bishop of Rome became sort of the leader of Christendom all over the place, as far as it had spread. Mostly it was in the Roman Empire still, but don't forget that the Roman Empire in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries included big portions of North Africa. And we tend to think of it as a European thing, but it was really and truly, especially when it comes to contributions to the literature that we have and the customs that we have and the culture that developed, was about half European and half North African. So there was a great deal of input into the way that the church developed coming out of North Africa. So along it goes. The most important bishop was the Bishop of Rome, and today we call him the Pope. That name came along early, so that he's been called the Pope for a very, very long time. But he is really and truly the Bishop of Rome. Whoever is selected to be the Bishop of Rome serves as the Pope. In the 15th century, up until then, most Christians, especially Christians in the western part of the civilized world, that would be Western Europe, were what we call today Roman Catholics. There were also Orthodox Christians in the eastern part of Europe, and there were Coptic Christians in North Africa. But the churches that all of the American churches have grown out of, all of the American Protestant churches have grown out of, were all Roman Catholic at that point. And notice that I say Roman Catholic because in the creed we say, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That Catholic is used in the meaning of the word Catholic, which is universal. Catholic means, it's just a word that has a meaning, and the meaning is universal. The Roman Catholic Church selected it as part of its name to be the Roman Universal Church, right? But it still means universal, just like the United Methodist Church can't take united out of our vocabulary, even though they have it for their name. So around the 15th century, that would be the 1600s, there was a lot going on in Europe, and there was a lot of struggle between people. At that time, most countries were made up of tiny princedoms, little kingdoms made up a whole country. And in almost every one of them, there was someone who wanted to unite them all into a single country and be the king of the whole shebang. Those little princes, they weren't little people. They were just princes of small areas. Didn't like that at all. And there was a lot of stress between different groups of princedoms. And you see that especially in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, in Austria, Italy, and Great Britain. So an idea developed and it's usually referred to as the divine right of kings. And that meant that these were people who were insisting that no one could take away their kingship from them or their princeship from them because it was God who had made them king. And if God made you king, then you had the right to remain king no matter what. Now that's a handy idea, right? A pretty handy idea. And it actually is the reason that the Protestant movement started primarily by Martin Luther, but going on simultaneously in Switzerland and other places. The reason that it worked, because the princes saw in that movement some power, and they felt like about things going on in the Roman Catholic Church. England was pretty much apart from all this because they're an island. They don't have any European neighbors over there, and they could be very insulated from what was going on if they chose to. Clearly, there were no telephones, no television, no mass information spreaders. So if you didn't want to listen to what was going on over there, you could easily not listen. And so everything was going along in England just as before, with the Roman Catholic Church safely ensconced in the British Isles. And then the king wanted to get a divorce. And he had to have permission from the Pope to get a divorce. And his response to that was, if God made me king, why do I have to get your permission to do anything? And he decided, this was Henry VIII, he decided to cut England off from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Henry didn't expect anything to change, except instead of the Pope being in charge, he was going to be in charge himself. He expected the church to just go on exactly as it had gone before. And here I need to stop for one important point. One of the backbones of both the Roman Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church is this idea that Jesus put his hands on Peter's shoulders and he said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Peter became the first bishop of Rome. And since then, every bishop has been consecrated under the hands of bishops that were first consecrated by Peter, which means it's a direct line of consecration all the way back to when Jesus put his hands on Peter's shoulders. Now, along the way, lots and lots of churches have broken that unbroken line. At the time that Henry decided to just kind of cut Britain off from the Catholic Church, all of the bishops in England had been consecrated in that line from Peter. So they had maintained that apostolic succession, they call it. Well, that has continued to be a very big deal in church business. Such a big deal that in 2000, when the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church decided to recognize each other's orders, so that, for example, I can take a job as a priest in a Lutheran church, or you could hire a Lutheran minister if you wanted to in the Episcopal Church today. When that happened, the Lutherans had to agree that for a whole generation, every bishop consecrated had to have an Episcopal bishop present to reestablish apostolic succession. You may not think it's a big deal. It's a big deal. I mean, I have to gear myself up to make it sound like a big deal, but the world considers it a big deal. And so Henry thought everything was going to stay just the same. And they're still going to have Mass in Latin, and the priests are still not going to get married, and everything's going to go on just like it has always been going on. Only he appointed Thomas Cranmer as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas was both, Thomas had everything in the world to do with what happened next. If you ever have a chance to read a biography of Thomas Cranmer, this is a fascinating character. Almost all of the language in the Book of Common Prayer has grown out of the language that he wrote in the 16th century in the first Book of Common Prayer. He wrote the book beginning to end. I mean, he took lots of pieces out of the Bible, right? He was also responsible for seeing that the Bible was translated into vernacular English so that people could just read it. And that was a very, very big deal. Because it was in the 16th century, in the 1500s, that Gutenberg first printed the Bible. So it was a new thing to think that there would be Bibles that people could just take off the shelf and read. Up until then, every Bible that anybody owned had been copied by hand. So that was a big step forward. And not only read it, but read it in English. And the Bible had not been available in any language except Latin since the 11th century. Prior to that, Bibles were available primarily in Greek. So average people had never read the Bible. They just listened in church and had some explanation given, and that's all they knew about what it said in the Bible. So he had the Bible translated to English, And then he wrote the Book of Common Prayer, and then he took a sabbatical and went to Germany for 4 years. And he was perfectly sure that now that they had this new church in England, that the priests should be able to get married, and he did. Without asking anybody's permission, he just got married and had, I think, 4 children while he was there. And he returned to England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to this church where priests can't get married, with 4 kids and a wife. And so right away, they changed the rules, because the king couldn't get along without Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer was the brains of the church and the brains of this new movement. Now, there were a lot of things that happened. A lot of things that happened in England that had to do with who was king and who was queen, and it went back and forth whether the new Anglican church, Anglican is a word that means English, whether the new Anglican church would be actually Catholic, or if it Roman Catholic, or if it would be a Protestant church. But they worked it out with Queen Elizabeth. And then here we are, right? So in the 1600s, early 1600s, actually in 1607, Robert Hunt was the chaplain that came with the group of people who settled in Jamestown in 1607, and he brought the Anglican Church with him. And the first church built in the new colonies was an Anglican church, and you can still stand in it there at the ruins at Jamestown if you go to visit Jamestown. Then more and more people came from England. Now remember, we're still British colony, right? British colonies. More and more people kept coming from England, and what were they bringing with them but the English church? Now, in the English church, all the way back to Henry VIII, the king or the queen is like the head of the church, and they appoint a cleric, that means a person who's ordained, to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the highest ranking bishop in the country. But the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king or the queen have a lot of interaction in the leading of the church. That's still true today, still true. With King Charles, which I seem to have a hard time saying, because Queen Elizabeth became queen when I was 6. And she stayed king for a really long time. Anyway, they brought the Anglican Church with them. And it was the most prominent church in the New World. It was not the only one. Most of the Puritans who came were also Anglicans. They were just Puritan Anglicans. And when the Methodists started to come, they were also Anglicans. They were just Methodist Anglicans. So that is kind of like, you might have heard that term, high church Anglicans and low church, or high church Episcopalians and low church Episcopalians, and other kinds of, there are lots of different ways of doing church within that umbrella that calls itself the Episcopal Church. That was true in the Anglican Communion as well. Now, so that was from 1607 until until the Revolution. When the Revolution happened, can you imagine how unpopular it could possibly have been to be an English thing, to be going to the English church in this place when we were fighting a war against the English, right? That was not going to hold water. That wasn't a good plan. So they changed their name from the Anglican Church to, I have to read this because it doesn't make all that much sense to me, to the Protestant Episcopal Church. They named themselves the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States. And that happened in 1780. So it was after the Revolution. But they had already adopted the name Episcopal before that. And in fact, quite a lot of things had happened then before they officially called themselves the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. They chose the name Episcopal because It's a Greek word. Episkopoi is the Greek word for bishops. And they wanted to say that they were not Catholic and not English either. I mean, they were picking a name that said, we are not Catholic and we are not English. So the Protestant, meaning not Catholic, Episcopal, meaning with bishops, in the United States, meaning not English, was the name they chose. And those were all things that the church actually was. Come on in. So in 1789, which was quite a long time, a whole decade after the Revolution, they've called the first General Convention. And this is really important, not for you to remember the numbers, but for you to have a picture of the timeline in your head. Because as you're going to find out in a minute, General Convention is really an important thing, number one. And number two, it meant that the church had gotten organized. Now the Episcopal Church in the United States was organized. And they had done that. They had written a constitution, and that's why they called the convention, so that they could adopt the constitution. And the constitution was written pretty much exclusively by a committee, but the committee led with a great deal of enthusiasm by Bishop White, who was the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia. Now, this is interesting, and this is a really kind of weird thing to know. Bishop White was the chaplain of the Continental Congress. And it was in the basement of his church that the American Constitution was written, along with him and the leaders of the church in Philadelphia, the leading leaders of the people in Philadelphia. But since the vast majority of people were Episcopalians, the same group of people, with a few changes here and there, sat down in the same basement and wrote the Constitution of the church. Just a couple of years later. So one good idea used twice, right? And it is one idea. So let me tell you about how the church is organized. They decided that it should be a representative democracy. Can you imagine? That's exactly what they had decided when they wrote the Constitution of the United States, right? It's we don't all vote, and every vote for one thing or another. We elect people or select people who go with our message to a convention and they vote. And that was really important then because communication was so slow. It could take months to get back and forth and answer, right? So they just trusted the person that they had chosen, and they sent imagine a whole city would pick 3 people and send them to the convention with instructions on how to vote. Truth is, nobody knew if they did or not because you couldn't get any information, but that's how it worked. That's how it worked for American politics, and that's how it worked in the church too. So they had 2 houses. The 2 houses, the one that's like the Senate is called the House of Bishops. And a person is a member of the House of Bishops and from the time they're consecrated until they retire. They are still actually a member, but they're not voting members after their retirement. Because you are a bishop in the Episcopal Church from the time you're consecrated until you die, no matter how long you retired or how long you serve, either one. The second house was called, the one that's like the House of Representatives in American government, is called the House of Delegates. And the House of Delegates is made up of all of the lay, that means not clergy, not ordained people, the lay people, and the clergy from every diocese. So in this country, there are 100 dioceses. They are like states. They're like little organizational spaces. They're geographical like a state. And each one is led by a diocesan bishop. So There are 100 people in the House of Bishops, representing 100 dioceses, and then there are a whole lot more people in the House of, like there are in the House of Representatives, a whole lot more people in the House of Delegates. Sometimes, if a vote is close on an idea or a new rule or a new way of doing things, it has to pass in both, right? So it's not a lot different at all from the American government. The thing is, we don't meet nearly as often, just once every 3 years for 2 weeks. It's the largest convention in the United States after the Republican convention. It's the second largest convention that takes place in the United States. And it's very newsworthy. I cannot tell you how much news coverage it gets. It's so strange to me. So each diocese is led by one bishop, one diocesan bishop. But they can have assisting bishops or assistant bishops or suffragan bishops to help them. And each of those names just describe a slightly different avenue and a slightly different amount of authority. None of them have the authority of the diocesan bishop because that person is responsible for what happens in the whole diocese. And usually those assisting bishops have an area of responsibility. But for example, I said there were 100 bishops. There actually are more than 100 bishops in the House of Bishops because some of those assisting bishops, not the suffragans and not the assistant bishops, but the assisting bishops, based on what their contract says and what their job is, can be part of the House of Bishops. So there are a few more. In this diocese, we have Bishop Sam Rodman, who is our diocesan bishop, and we used to have Bishop Ann Hodges-Koppel. Bishop Ann was an assistant bishop. We have Bishop Ann has retired, and we have a new bishop whose name is Jennifer Brooks Davidson. Jennifer Brooks Davidson. And she is an assisting bishop, so she is part of the House of Bishops. And so what happens at these conventions and among these houses, these groups of representatives, when we have a convention, our diocese chooses 4 lay people and 4 ordained people, either priests or deacons, to be our representatives. Come on in, sweetheart. To be our representatives at convention. So every one of those dioceses has a minimum of 8. You also have some other people that are sent to convention. So for example, the youth groups of the Episcopal Church around the country have diocesan representatives that are sent to convention. And when they get there, they meet with the leaders of the youth groups from all over the country. There are other kinds of groups that send representatives to hold their own sort of sidebar meetings at convention. And there are some other things that happen there, like, for example, there are a group of very large and wealthy churches in the country that consider them that have endowments. They have like a whole lot of money in the bank, and they're living on the interest from it. They're called endowed parishes. Most of those have been around for a long time because that was a very popular thing to do in the 17 and 1800s. If you had made a lot of money to, in your will, leave all of your money to the church. Sort of an idea you could buy your way to heaven maybe, but there are churches that have huge amounts of money and they don't spend it, they just live on the interest from it. And they're called endowed parishes. So there's a group of people called the Consortium of Endowed Parishes. Well, the Consortium of Endowed Parishes always have a very lovely meeting with fabulous food and good wine at convention. But people get together there for a variety of reasons. and a lot of business happens. But all of the business that comes to the convention has already been thought about and talked about by committees. And the committees bring motions to the convention floor. And again, almost exactly like happens in Congress. So, among other things, they pass laws, the laws of the church. And those laws can be enforced in court. In the United States, they're considered legal laws applied to the church. And so an example of that would be that according to the laws of the church, the property belongs to the church, to the greater church, to the diocese, to the national church. All the properties. It doesn't actually belong to the parish. The parish can't sell it. And when in 2003, there was a man in Vermont whose last name was Robinson, who was elected Bishop of New Hampshire. Did I say Vermont? I mean New Hampshire. Elected to be the Bishop of New Hampshire. And he was a gay man. And the church, some people in the church were really upset about that. And they got very uppity about it. And some churches, some parishes, decided to go be another kind of church. And actually, there's one right there in Orange County, right up here in Chapel Hill, it's called an Anglican church. It's not actually part of the Anglican Communion. They just used the word Anglican. But some others chose other kinds of names. They were so mad that they left the Episcopal Church. You know, things like that happen. It happened when they ordained women, and it happened when the new prayer book came out. And it almost happened when the new hymnal came, because we are very, very stuck in our ways. New things don't often go over very well. So, can you guess when they ordained women? First began to ordain women? It wasn't actually the first time, but do you know when it was? 1979. You might think that's a really long time ago, but it's not. It is not. Anyway, Bishop Robinson turned out to be a fantastic bishop. And, but those churches who decided to leave had to go buy another building because they couldn't take the building they were in with them. And there were lots of big legal fights that went all the way to the Supreme Court about that. And it turns out that the property really does belong to the church. You cannot do that. And that courts will enforce church canons. Now, the laws of the church are called canons, exactly the same word as the big boom gun, right? And there are national canons that tell us what the national church expects in the world. And then there are local canons that tell us how business is going to be done in our diocese. And then we have bylaws in our individual parish to tell us how we're going to live into the laws that the diocese and the national church have already established. All of this is to say that this is not a congregational church. Let me tell you what a congregational church is. A congregational church is a church that makes up its own mind what it's going to be, how it's going to enforce its rules, what rules it's going to make. I'm talking about a parish, a church like ours. It meets on Sunday. If they want to have a minister, they pick out somebody and they offer them a job. There are lots and lots and lots of churches like that around. And in fact, there's some benefits to being a congregational church. But there are huge benefits to being part of something bigger than our parish. I'll give you an example. The national church, when our parish buys insurance, we buy it from church insurance. It belongs to the Episcopal Church. The insurance company belongs to the Episcopal Church. we get what we want. I mean, we get what we need. We really, really, really get what we need. Another kind of thing that goes along with that is, for example, I lived a long time in the Diocese of Southeast Florida. One summer, our little church got hit by 5 hurricanes full blast. And the wonderful thing was that we had the whole country on our side. You know, states from all, no telling where, sent crews in to help rebuild the churches, because we are really all one church. We also have Episcopal Relief and Development that is run by the National Church, and churches contribute to it, and members of churches contribute to it when there's some kind of a disaster in the world. When they had the Haiti earthquake, a huge team, a team of about 25 people, experts, were sent to Haiti to help them redevelop and to use the money that was contributed in a responsible way to do the most that could be done with that much money. And they are still there. They stay until there is real recovery. That's one of the things that happens almost never in the world. When there is a crisis in a country like the earthquake in Haiti, people send money or they run in to help, but then after about 6 months, they're all gone and the place is still a disaster, a literal disaster. But when Episcopal Relief and Development goes, that help lasts as long as it's needed. It is really an amazing thing. The church in the United States has worked together to do things like provide clean water in Nicaragua. Do you know how important clean water is? Do you know that people, many people, maybe half the people in the world live somewhere where the water they drink can make them so sick they die? It doesn't always do that, but it could. And when you drink a glass of water out of the tap, you don't know what you're getting. That's frightening. And it's also absolutely devastating to a family when their children get dysentery or amoebic dysentery or giardia or something from the water and die from dehydration because they're so sick. And that happens. It happens frequently. So being part of something bigger matters. It really matters. It's not that we have to have a picnic with Trinity Church in Fuquay. We probably will never do that. We might. I mean, they're nice people. I used to work there. But we probably won't do it, and they're only a little ways down the road, just on the other side of Holly Springs. But they're still part of who we are. They're still part of who we are. There's a huge amount of support in that. When we kneel down and pray, the thing about the Book of Common Prayer is that it's common. And that means not that you can find one on every corner. What that means is that it is used by all of us. Not just in the United States, but the Book of Common Prayer in its own derivation has all the way back to Cranmer, first Book of Common Prayer. All the books of common prayer around the world in the Anglican Communion have come from there. Every one of them. The Church of South Africa, that's not it. Church of South India, I'm sorry, is not even an Anglican church, but they use the Book of Common Prayer for their worship. The entire vast majority of people in New Zealand are Anglicans, and they're using the Book of Common Prayer, the New Zealand Book of Common Prayer. In my office, I have a New Zealand Book of Common Prayer, an Australian Book of Common Prayer, a French Book of Common Prayer, El Libro de Oración Común, a Spanish one here in my office. The Book of Common Prayer means that whether the words are identical or not, when we kneel down to pray, We are praying with people all over the whole world. All over the world. We're praying the same prayers. Just like when we say a prayer all together in here, we're doing that same thing with people all over the whole world. And it used to be that the biggest portion of the single biggest piece of the Anglican Communion was the American Episcopal Church. And then it was the church in the Americas. And then it was, now it is Africa. Africa has more Anglicans than any other continent in the world. So every country's church, the Episcopal Church in the United States, is part of the Anglican Communion because we choose to be. We were invited and we choose to be. But the people in England have no authority over us. We are part of a group of people that elect to get together and talk about our common problems and common solutions. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the head of the Anglican Communion in name, has no authority over the American church at all. We are led in this church by a bishop who is elected to fill that position, the position of presiding bishop. The presiding bishop right now used to be the bishop of this diocese. Michael Curry is his name, and his office is in New York City on 2nd Avenue. And his cathedral, or his church, is the National Cathedral in Washington. Have anybody ever been to the National Cathedral? Well, has anybody ever been to Washington? You missed your chance to go to the National Cathedral. I have to tell you, you should go and you should tell them when you get there that you're an Episcopalian, because it's an Episcopal church. But obviously, people from all over the world visit the National Cathedral, right? It took 65 years to build it. And it is really spectacular. You know what it has? You see our beautiful windows? It has one window that has like the planets and the outer space in the picture in the window is outer space. And in the middle of the window, there's a moon rock, a real rock from the moon. And you know how they got it? Right across the street from the National Cathedral is a little Episcopal church that was there before the cathedral called St. Albans. And St. Albans has a school, and it's a good school, and it's an Episcopal school. And for reasons that are maybe known, but not to me, completely unknown to me, some enormous percentage, like 40% of all of the American astronauts went to elementary school at St. Albans. So when they came back from the moon, one of those children from St. Albans, hi, come on in. One of those children from St. Albans had been on the moon and brought a rock back for the cathedral. And so they put it in the window. You know, it's just Episcopal Church trivia, but it's pretty fun. And you really should, if you go to Washington, you really should make an effort to visit the cathedral. You can go online and take a virtual tour, and that's really pretty interesting too. So sometime you're just sitting in front of your computer, go online to the National Church website and take a little tour. You'll want to go after you've taken a tour. And if I'm still here in October, I will take all of our acolytes to Washington to the Acolyte Festival. That's a promise. But I can't promise I'll still be here. And I don't know if the next person will live into that promise or not. But I did that over there at the church in Fuquay Varina, and it was so much fun. So now I've just given you like a fire hose amount of information. So would you all like to ask some questions? or make comments, or say that's a bunch of baloney? Really? Yes.
So was the original Bibles, were they read in Latin to the people? Did they just,
You know how we have readings in church? They did too. They didn't have, and actually no other church has, the same quantity of readings that we have in ours. But they would read a short passage and then preach on that. Usually the preacher would read it. Although, by the time we got to the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States, so that would have been the late 1700s. By that time, there were things being read in the services. This side was the gospel side, so the gospel would be read there, and the epistle was read over there, but they didn't have a psalm usually or an Old Testament reading. So that's sort of morphed along through history. This idea of people being able to read the Bible in their own language was really across all of Christendom has been a problem. I mean, there have been people, particularly monks and people like that, who thought that was a terrible idea, that you shouldn't trust I'm going to use a word you don't know, the hoi polloi, the regular people in the world, with such dangerous information.
So you're saying before the Bible was translated?
It was kept in Latin, and before that in Greek, so that only people of very high education levels could read it.
In church at that time, when they read a Bible passage, was it?
They read it in Latin or Greek.
I guess some people still didn't know.
So in the Catholic Church, everything was done in Latin, including the readings, until 1964. Until 1964. And I was actually in Rome, when that council met and made that decision to translate them to local languages. Yeah.
As far as the number of people that are Episcopal in the United States compared to other...
It's not very big.
It's not.
Mm-mm. I think we have... I can't, I'm sorry, I need to look, I'll look it up for you.
As far as being like as large as Methodist or Baptist or...
You know, no, we're not as large as they are. On the other hand, the Baptists are not all, there are lots of different Baptist governing bodies, and so when we count Baptists, we just count Baptists, but they're not all the same. They're not all one. The Methodist, this is an interesting thing. Do you all remember that I told you that it's really okay to go to church? It is part of who we are, is that we worship with people that we may not agree with. Do you remember that discussion? That it's the fact that we each bring our own point of view to something, and then we can talk about it, and then we can, if we're gracious enough to not argue but to listen, the Holy Spirit can make some truth out of all of that over the longest time. During the Civil War, the Episcopal Church is the only major church, only mainline church in the United States that didn't separate into North and South. And actually, when there were battles, people on both sides would leave their weapons at the door and come in and worship together, then go back out and fight some more. But that's why you have Southern Baptist and American Baptist. The northern half of the Southern Baptist is the American Baptist Church. The reason that you have the United Methodist Church is because they separated and got back together and became the United Church. Same with, there are some churches that don't actually exist as a national church at all, and so they didn't have to split because they're more, typically more geographically connected, smaller geographic areas. In the Lutheran Church, there are different synods, different types of Lutherans, and they typically come from different places, some from Germany, some from Sweden, some from, different places, Denmark. And they have very different beliefs. They're still all Lutherans. They have very different beliefs one from another. So.
On Sunday when we have readings, is every Episcopal church in the country?
Not just every Episcopal church, but almost every Protestant church. And I believe now even the Catholics are using the same one. Until about maybe 10 years ago, they were very similar, and a lot of days they were the same, but the Episcopal lectionary was slightly different from what some other churches were using. But about 10 years ago, there was an agreement made, and everybody decided to subscribe to the common lectionary. So there's just one now. Well, there's some sense behind that. I mean, the lectionary is designed based on the church year to some extent, but also it's certainly easier for the clergy because books that are published, commentaries on the lectionary that help you decide what you're going to say in your sermon, those kind of things. To have a book published that's only for the Episcopal Church. It's not impossible because the Episcopal Church owns church publishing. It's just, and being able to talk to another minister from another church and talk about what you're doing this week, and it's nice. Has anybody in here ever read the Bible? Yeah. So one year, I think I've said this before, one year I read the Bible out loud, the whole Bible from the first page to the last page, from the pulpit, at 7 o'clock every morning for the whole year, except for Sundays. Sundays were exempt because we had other reading. I mean, we had readings, that weren't in. Those readings were going straight through. Actually, it wasn't that we started with Genesis and finished with the Acts of the Apostles or Revelation. It's that somebody had put together a schedule. So we had a big piece of the Old Testament, a psalm, a piece of the epistles, and a piece of the Gospels. And so you didn't have to read just a whole day's reading of begat and begat and begat and begat. Whose mother is whose father is whose father, and so forth. So that's kind of like reading the telephone book. I bet some of you guys don't even know what a telephone book is. Anyway, any other comments, questions? Nothing? Fabulous.
Like a 4-year course that talks about all this stuff, and it's super neat.
And you can get college credit for it.
It's cool. It's a great program, but it kind of talks about all this stuff.
It does. Education for Ministry is one of the best things you can do in the church. It's wonderful.
Is it in person?
Mm-hmm.
The one I did was, and it's a 4-year program, but all 4 years are in the same meeting. So like you have year 1s, year 2s, year 3s, and year 4s, and each year talks about a different part of the Bible or like a different section of Christian history. And so the kind of like you're talking about the connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
So the Old Testament would be connected in year 1 to the New Testament in year 2 to like early Christian history in year 3 and
Yes.
more modern in year 4. So that it's super cool.
It's actually a course from the University of the South, from Swanee. And it's really excellent adult education, but it's a pretty big commitment. It's actually, I think, an enormous commitment. It's not just that it's 4 years. It's usually once a week. And it's just in your group, you become really close to one another and you know each other really well. Say you have 9 or 8, 10 people in your group and you've been with them once a week for 4 years, it's transformative in a faith way as well as in an education way, and it's really wonderful. But you need to decide you're ready. I hope some of you will do it. It's wonderful. Anybody else? That's called, sometimes it's referred to as EFM. It's Education for Ministry. And remember that I told you that every baptized person is a minister, right? So if you've been baptized, you have a ministry. You may not have started it yet. But you do have one. So it's education so that you feel more confident in the ministries that you accept. Anybody? Wow, I didn't even know if I'd be able to get through all this tonight. I really gave you the shortcut version of church history, but we have 2 minutes. If you have anything to say, you have 2 minutes. I believe in staying on time. I believe on being finished when the bell rings. Thank you. I hope you'll come back next week. If you missed some of this and you want to catch up, you can look at it on YouTube, on the church. St. Bartholomew, I think it's St. Bart's, Pittsburgh, but it might be St. Bartholomew's, Pittsburgh, on YouTube. And you don't have to pay, you don't have to join YouTube. You can just go to YouTube and watch it. If you should, did you send a link, Kevin?
Yes, it's in the weekly news.
It's in the news that comes on on email to your parents' computers, or your computer, and you can click on that to get straight to it.
Yeah, once you go to the YouTube channel, you can look at any of the meetings or classes or services. They're all still there.
Thank you. Bye, whoever's out there. I know specifically of some people who are, visiting us from there. We do have viewers because of, in this case, I think it's a COVID inconvenience. Well, have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next Wednesday. We only have, I think, 2 more.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. We're going to talk about theology. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if I forget, don't let me forget. I need to tell you what to say when somebody says, Episcopal, isn't that just like Catholic? Or if they say, Catholic light. I have really good answers for those things, and I'm going to tell them to you next week.
What a teaser.
Oh, thank you. Did anybody else bring their paperwork back?
We have ours ready, and it's on the kitchen counter.
Yeah, it's okay. It'll